Yo, what's up guys? In this video we are going to make shaker cabinet door on the table saw, minimal tools, show you guys that it is possible to make a good quality door on your table saw. So here we go. Alright, so the reason for making this video is kind of to show you guys it is possible to do stuff without all these specialty tools. Obviously, I have shapers and stuff like that that I make all my cabinet doors on, and it's a very fast process when you have those machines. But I didn't always have those machines. Before that, I was making them all on router tables, and before that, I was making shaker doors on the table saw. So we're gonna make this cabinet door on the table saw today, and I'm gonna show you my step-by-step process on how I go about that. And obviously, there's gonna be different ways to do it. I'm just gonna show you one of the ways that I've done it in the past, and they come out really nice. You get a really nice tight joint. It's a very strong cabinet door and pretty simple to make. Now obviously this is going to take a little bit longer than me using my shapers and stuff like that, but that's not the point. The point is to do this with limited tools. So let's get into it. So the first cut I'm going to make, which is different than if I was running these on the shaper. When I'm making doors on my shapers, I'm always coping first. So the cope cut is obviously where you're getting your tenon. It's the cut on the end of your rails. So I'm always cutting that first on the shaper for a few different reasons. If it's a shaker door, it doesn't have to be done first, but I'm just in the habit of that because even if you're doing like an OG or different profile, you want to cut the cope first, because if you do get any tear out on the back end when you go to run the groove or the edge profile on the shaper, it's going to clean that up. But anyways, that's besides the point. We're not doing that here. We're gonna run our groove and our rails and our stiles first. Reason being, I'm gonna do a 1/4 inch panel on these, and I wanna get that groove, or I wanna get that panel fitting in the groove nicely, and then we'll move on to getting the tenon fit into the groove nicely. So I do have my material already milled up. I've got my rails and my stiles cut down to size, and I did mill up a couple extra parts for test pieces. Always a good idea to give yourself a few extra pieces to run for the test. So even when I'm running parts on the shaper, I'll make up some test pieces as well. Even if they're already set up, I do like to mill up a couple extra small pieces just so I can run a test piece, make sure everything is still dialed in and fitting correctly. In this case, I wanted to make some test pieces because I don't have anything set up yet. So I want to be able to run a test piece in case I do make a mistake and run a cut wrong before I run it on my actual finished cut parts. So it's just a couple small extra pieces, and trust me, you will be happy that you did this. And I'm using material that I milled up, but you can certainly go to the lumber yard and buy lumber already milled up to do this. So we're working with 3/4 material, and we're going to get a 1/4 inch groove, and we're going to get it right in the center of the edge of these pieces. I want my groove is going to be a 1/2 inch deep. So first thing I'm going to do is take my stick ruler. I'm going to set the height of my blade to a 1/2 inch. And that's where these stick rulers, I know I've mentioned these in a couple videos before, I believe, but these are super handy. I always have one of these in the shop in my pocket, especially setting up your tools, your machines. Has all the measurements you need on it, and it has graduation lines on the end. So if you put your stick ruler down like this, it's really nice for setting the height of your blade or your cutters on the shaper or router table, whatever. It's very handy for setting up your machines. So I'm gonna lower this down and then come up when I'm setting stuff like this, whether it's the table saw blade or a shaper cutter. You always want to go down until you feel the threads and get it down below like where you need to be, and then come back up where you feel those threads kind of catch, because you don't want this thing dropping down. All right, so I'm right at 1/2 inch high. So then I've got a scrap piece of 1/4 inch MDF. That's going to be our panel, and I want to get that right in the center of this test piece. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna set my fence, because these are exactly at 3/4. So I'm gonna set my fence to 1/4 inch, because I'm gonna end up with a 1/4 inch groove in the middle, and then I'll have a 1/4 inch shoulder or tab left over on each side. So I'm gonna set my fence to 1/4 inch, a little bit heavy, and I'll show you the reason why. So we come here, we're 1/4 inch, a little bit heavy. So what that's gonna do, I'm gonna run my piece here, and then I'm gonna spin it, and I'm gonna run it there, and that's gonna give me my groove directly in the center, and it's going to probably be a little bit, the groove will probably be a little bit too small on my first pass here, but then I can bump the fence over a tiny bit and really creep up on that cut, so I get a nice snug fit for the panel. So I ran my test. I actually had 2 little test pieces, and the first one I ran after I scooted the fence over the second time. I went a little too much, so it was a little bigger than I wanted that to be. So we're not going to use that one. But luckily, I have another test piece. So I've got a really nice fit here. You can see that that is just, I don't want to have to force this thing on, and I also don't want it to be like this one where it's just kind of rattling in there. So this, you can see, is like a perfect fit. It just slides right on there, and then it won't fall off, but I can just pull it right off nice and easily, so it's not super tight. So now that I know my test piece is good, I can take my actual parts and run all of those. So let's do that. All right, so I did end up, so my material must be a tiny bit over 3/4, so I did end up with a little, because when I ran the test, I ran 2 pieces, a little tiny paper thin piece of wood left over in the middle of that groove. So I'll just take my stick ruler and slide it down there, and it just snaps off and comes right out. So then I've got my groove all set, and my rails and my stiles. All right, so all my grooves are cut, everything's good. Let's just make sure here that panel is nice, fitting snug. Now we'll move on to the tenon. All right, so now I can move my fence. I can get that out of the way. I've got my test piece here. And so the first cut we're gonna make is called the shoulder cut. So that is on the end of your piece here, and it's this cut. So it's a cross cut, and this is gonna give us the length of our tenon. So I want my tenon to finish at 1/2 inch deep, and that's plenty for a cabinet door. A lot of router sets and even shaper sets for cabinet doors, the tenons are only 3/8. I buy mine, you can buy them when they're 1/2 inch. I prefer the 1/2 inch tenon, just gives you a little more, but it's plenty for a cabinet door. If we were making some bigger doors, some man doors or something like that, we'd certainly be doing some larger tenons on these. But I'm going to lower my blade down to the 1/4 inch. I can use my test piece here to set the height of my cut. So I can lay this down, and I want to just be coming up to that groove. And it's okay if I go a little bit over, a hair over. That's okay on this cut. And there's a couple different ways you could do this. So you could do this with a dado blade if you have one, and you could do this in one cut and flip your piece over and then do the other side and get your tenon in one pass. We're gonna do this a little different, and we're gonna do this in two cuts, two different cuts. So, and get a really nice fit. And now I'm gonna set, I want to be a 1/2 inch from my fence to the left side of the blade. So I'm gonna use my stick ruler again and just get it to 1/2 inch to that side, and boom, right there. It would be not very safe to take your piece and just push it against the fence and run it like that, because chances are this thing is pretty narrow. You're gonna get some movement and you can get kickback, and it could be very dangerous. So don't do that. Most table saws, even little contractor saws, come with a miter gauge like this. The ones with contractor saws are kind of a little bit janky. Even this one, I'm gonna actually go this way. Even this one is not, you know, I don't really use this thing a lot. So, but this is just gonna give us a guide to hold our piece right in place, and so that it can't move and we won't get any kickback. It's just a safe way to do this. So we'll turn this on and we'll make our cuts in our test piece. All right, so I ran both sides of this, and that's just gonna give me 2 tests to run when we do our next set of cuts and get this thing fitting in the groove. So now I can run my other pieces, my actual rails. I'll run this shoulder cut, and we'll move on to the next step. The next cut is going to be where we really get this tenon dialed in and fitting nice in the groove. You could make a series of cuts and just finish this off right here on the table saw and just slide your piece over. I always did it differently, just with this extra step, just because I felt like I could get a way more consistent and nicer fitting tenon than doing it that way. Also, the blade I have in here is not giving me a flat bottom on my cut. I'm gonna go grab a jig that I made years ago, and we're gonna get these tenons cut. All right, so I made this a couple years ago, and to be honest, I cannot remember what the job was that I made this for. But I made it knowing that I could use it for stuff like this, or if I'm making bigger doors, and it's just a kind of a handy jig that you can use for other things, for other types of cuts on your table saw. So all this is really simple. It's just got this U shape down here, couple pieces of plywood. You can see the back. It's just a frame sitting on top of these 3 pieces of plywood that make a U. See the bottom there? And this just slides over. Oh no. This does not fit over my table saw fence. I just realized that the last time I used this, or when I made this, I didn't have this piece of wood on my table saw fence. I had this other piece of this UHMW, whatever that stuff is, the white stuff. And that thing was pretty beat up, so I took it off, and this is a little bit thicker than that was. So I'm just gonna make a cut here and cut out a little bit. I only need like a 1/16 of an inch on the back side of this. And that'll give me, that way this will fit over this. I totally forgot about that, but yeah, things happen, but we can fix it and we can still use this jig. All right, I think I got it cut. I don't want this I want it snug. So that's like perfect, because we don't want a ton of moving around here. I am gonna throw some paste wax just on the inside of this so that it will slide nice and smooth. And so like I said, you don't have to do it this way with the jig. You can certainly get away with doing those couple extra cuts with the tenon laying down. I like to do it this way just because I feel like it gives me a better fit. And this jig took me, I don't know, maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours to make. It's really simple. I did route some grooves in here so I can get a clamp through and clamp my piece to this, and this is really very safe to use. It's big, I can have my hands way up out of the way and just make my cut. Now that we're back to work here, I can take my test piece and I can set the blade height with this. Make sure your jig is nice and square to your table because we don't want our tenon, you know, like that. It's going to give us not a straight cut. And I can see we're nice and square here. So I want to set this up to have it cutting on the left side, on the far side of my piece. Because if I cut on this side, if I cut this side off, it's going to leave a tiny little piece caught between there and the blade. It's going to be so small that it would actually drop into the groove, but just good practice to never have anything in between your fence and your blade because pieces get stuck and kick back at you and stuff. Like I said, these are really tiny and thin, so it would fall through, but we're just going to get used to doing that. So I'm going to set this up to this side of the blade, and then we'll run this piece as a test and we'll see how the fit is. All right, so that cut is a little bit tight. I want to take a little bit more off of this thing. So I'm gonna hit my fence over a tiny bit. And you gotta remember, however tight this is, you don't wanna take that all in one pass because you're making 2 passes on that. So if this was, say, just for round numbers, if this was a 16th too big, I'd only want to move the fence over a 32nd because I have to cut it twice. If I take a 16th in one pass and then spin the piece around, take another 16th, then I took off an 1/8. So just something else to think about. Another thing to think about is this jig. These jigs, you can actually buy, I think Delta used to make a tenoning jig for a table saw. I don't know if they still make it, but you can find them for sale on eBay or whatever. And there's probably other companies too that have made tenoning jigs for the table saw. And then you don't have to make one, but all right, so now that's really a nice cut. That joint is perfect. One of the things you really want to make sure is that your tenon is not longer than the groove is, because if it is, that joint is never going to close up. So if anything, you want your groove to be a little bit deeper than the actual tenon. So then you're making sure you get a really nice tight joint there where these 2 pieces meet, because we don't want a gap. And this is a really nice joint. So now all we have left to do is cut the panel, and So one way to figure out your panel size, just let's dry fit this thing together. So then I'll just measure my inside dimension here. So it's 12 and 20. So with a 1/2 inch groove, I don't want my panel to be tight in there. I want a 1/16 inch gap all around my panel so it'll be floating, and then I just pin it in the back after I glue it up. So I'm gonna take that dimension 12 and I'm gonna add 7/16 on each side, so it'll be 12 and 7/8, and then same thing with the 20. So it'll be 12 and 7/8 by 20 and 7/8. That will be my panel size, and that will give me a 1/16 of an inch around my panel once it's glued up. So I just want to show you guys the joint real quick, show you how it came out. You can see it is nice and tight. There's no line there, there's no gap. Everything is nice and flush, and the tenon is sticking in there nice and snug, but not too tight. So that's perfect. That's the fit that we're looking for. We are almost ready for glue up. We are just about there. A couple more little things I like to do before we glue them up. First would be to sand this panel. I'll hit it with a DA with like 150 grit sandpaper. Second is, especially on these, because these have saw blade marks on the inside edge. So you want to sand the inside edge now, because after you glue it up, you're not really going to be able to do it without scratching up the panel. So I'll just hit this edge, and then I also hit the groove, the edges of the groove. I'll put my piece of sandpaper in that corner there, and just hit that edge, and that gives me a little bit of a round over there. And so when this thing, after it's glued up, and when I go to paint this, we don't want bridging, which is where it like fills in that gap, and then down the road the paint has the potential to paint or to crack. So we don't want that. So by doing this, it gives us a little bit of separation there, so that the paint doesn't bridge in that joint. So now we are ready to glue up, just using regular yellow wood glue. I already cut my stiles. Everything is cut to finish size. Typically, when I make doors, I make everything oversized and cut them down after when I'm doing a big job. But I have a whole nother video on my channel. It's a two-part video actually, of how I normally make doors with my shapers and everything like that. And I go into more detail, and it's a different process than this. This is to show you guys how to do this with limited tools. So if you're interested in that video, check it out right up here. But other than that, I've got these standoff thingies. They're literally just a piece of plywood screwed to another piece of plywood to make like a little, to get our work pieces off the bench. This just makes it easier to clamp, because when you can lay your clamps flat on your piece and they're not going to hit the table or anything like that. So these are just super handy. And I'm just going to take my stiles, I'll put my panel in, and then start gluing up. And so with everything cut to finish size, my rails, I want to get them nice and flush with the end of my stiles here. Make sure everything is good. If my rail needs to go out, instead of just taking my mallet and whacking it there, I'd get a block and hit that. It's going to prevent you from damaging the rail and putting a big dent in that corner. Really don't want that after all the work you just did to get all your parts ready. You don't want to start damaging your door parts. And then everything's nice and flush, and we'll just clamp it up. And boom. We are all set. Last thing to just check real quick. Grab a framing square, some kind of square, throw it in the corners, just make sure we're all good here, which we're looking pretty good. All right, we'll get this thing out of clamps. I'll just sand it real quick. Not even gonna put it through my drum sander. Just gonna hit it with the DA. Since my panel is floating, it's not glued in there, I do like to pin it in the back. So with the 1/4-inch panel, there's no way of telling if it's actually perfectly centered. So I just kind of feel, because I'm able to move it around with my fingers. So if I just kind of get it where I think is centered, and then I'll just pin it in the middle of the rail, and that's it. I'll fill in that little pin. So on typically the way I build doors, I'm making them 7/8 to 15/16 thick, and I actually use a 1/2-inch panel on my kitchen cabinet doors, and I rabbet out the back. So on the back of the door, I have a reveal that I get that centered. So then I know for sure it's centered. But this is just a 1/4-inch panel, so feel for it, get it where you think it needs to be, and then pin it and lock it in. So that's it, guys. There's my door. Came out nice. One way to check and make sure your door's nice and flat. Obviously, if I had a huge cabinet door, I don't really have a surface big enough to do this on, but my table saw surface is perfectly flat. I know that, and I can lay this door down and just feel if there's if this thing is bowed or if it's warped or anything like that, or I glued it up and not good, and it is good and flat. So you can make really high quality doors on your table saw. Obviously it's going to take a little bit longer than if you're doing it on the shaper or something like that, or router table, but it is possible. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. Hopefully you learned something. I want to do more stuff like this, more videos like this. It's actually kind of fun to do things, build some stuff with limited tools, you know, with maybe I'll build some cabinets with a track saw or something like that. Or if you have more ideas, let me know in the comments below. Eventually we'll hopefully make that happen. But hopefully you learned something. Hopefully this was helpful to somebody. The Patreon is up and running. If you'd like to become a patron and help support the channel, it is much appreciated. I'll leave the link below in the bio. But other than that, that's all I got. Like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And we will see you guys on the next one. Peace.